Hi, everybody. It's Susan again, and this time I thought I'd have a look at Prince Harry's chart, the Duke of Sussex, because very soon he's going to be publishing a book that everybody seems to be talking about. I have to say, I'm not much of a royalist, not much of a, what do you call that, a gossiper. I try not to judge people's lives, and I do have an enormous amount of compassion for people like this who are born into a public role. And in Harry's case particularly, he's born into a public role that he really doesn't want, or at least not under the conditions of restriction that he has been born into. So we have to have compassion for somebody like that on a human level. It's a bit of a Shakespearean tragedy. Nonetheless, I thought I'd have a look first at his natal chart to see what kind of makes him tick, and then we'll have a look at the transits on the 10th, which is the release of his book, and see how that's going to be affecting his chart. So we always want to look at the ascendant. It's very important in a natal chart. Of course, everything is important, but the ascendant, I think, really stands out because it sets the tone for the whole chart. And here we have an ascendant in Capricorn. Now, it's a pretty hard road when you have an ascendant in Capricorn. It almost doesn't matter where you are in your life or what type of work that you have. Capricorn ascendant always has a certain heaviness to it. And there's kind of no getting around that. That can work in people's favor over time, but often the early life in particular is challenging. We want to look at the ruler of the Capricorn ascendant because the ruler tells us a lot about why a Capricorn ascendant is the way it is, and that is Saturn, of course. And Saturn makes a person feel particularly responsible and responsible for a number of things that are not necessarily their problem. And so there can be an kind of an underlying feeling of guilt or responsibility that can cause a kind of a personal frustration, a feeling of responsibility that the person may or may not live up to. In Harry's case, this responsibility is very obvious because Saturn is in the 11th house in his chart. And it's very closely in a natal chart conjunct the midheaven. So within 5 degrees, it's actually just over 4. So that's in a natal chart. That's a really important conjunction. And it's a Saturn that's not really happy. It's a bit grouchy. In Scorpio, it's quite an intense energy. Saturn in Scorpio can bring about a certain amount of divine discontent, we can say. We have this same kind of energy with Pluto, which is close by. And of course, being on the midheaven, this is going to be visible to a lot of people, so that what we could call the burden of responsibility is very clear for everybody to see that weighs heavily on him. And we also see that in the 11th house, that it shows often a frustration in terms of one's own goals and dreams. So Saturn can delay things. It frustrates a person. The desire to do whatever it is that they want to do out in society feels frustrated. And in this case, often by authority figures. Saturn can represent authority figures, including the father. We also see that the midheaven in the 11th is showing that he has this social engagement, a social kind of commitment to his career point, to how we see him. He shows up in society. And then that Saturn is there restricting how he wants to show up. Saturn in the 11th house also can indicate having very few friends, what you could call few reliable friends. And in fact, often people will find that they have a lot of disappointments in friendships, that people who they relate to tend to come through their professional activities, especially when Saturn is so close to the midheaven in the 11th. And not so much from just intimate friends. So they'll meet people and have perhaps acquaintances that they enjoy through the things that they do. They have a shared experience, and that makes them friends, but it doesn't necessarily bring close friendships. And more to the point, it doesn't bring friendships that are trustworthy and can bring people into the life of the native where they are taken advantage of by friends. Yeah, it's not an easy one with this ascendant ruler in not great dignity. So already we see that there's a hard road paved for this self-described spare. His father, Prince Charles, when he was born, said, I have an heir and a spare. That's kind of a thing in royal lineage, that when you have a male heir, the second one is the sort of replacement if something should ever happen to the principal heir to the throne or to the family fortune or whatever it is. And so that sort of dismissive way of seeing Harry actually is very much filtering through the whole of the chart. It's not just, I think that expression in many ways summarizes his whole relationship to his life and his role in life and his family. I'm kind of an afterthought, that sort of feeling very much running through the chart. We can also look at the other houses of the chart that Saturn rules. So, of course, it's ruling the first house in Capricorn and also the second house, Aquarius. So that means that there's also going to be this kind of discomfort or tension around the second house. What is it? The values, his value, his sense of self-worth. That is also around issues of one's income and how one can establish an income. But also the second house is family. It's everything that supports you. It's everything that you have from childhood. And so we see that in this case, that's really a big hurdle for him as well. So we'll see that Saturn has big influence over the first and second house in the chart. Of course, that goes with all of Capricorn risings, but it also depends on the condition of the Saturn, how that's going to be lived out. So we'll see how different things affect this as well. Harry also has Jupiter in the first house, and it's not a really dignified Jupiter. So although Jupiter will bring a lot of vivaciousness and optimism to a person's life, this is really dampened down when it's in Capricorn. And Jupiter in Capricorn also suggests problems with the family. Capricorn in general, that axis between Capricorn and Cancer is very strongly related to the family. Interestingly, his mother Diana and his brother William both sit in his seventh house of relationships. Very, very important aspects of his chart. And this is something that, of course, is influencing him from afar by relationship. And he would always look to those individuals particularly as very important figures in his life. So that Jupiter in Capricorn can make a person a little bit worried about money. It can make a person feel lack around abundance, lack around a capacity to express oneself or just experiencing joy. Although I think he's also got his fun side as well. But I think the undercurrent is that that's somehow difficult for him. And then we see his sun up in Virgo in the ninth house. That's a lovely place for a sun. It's the joy of the sun in the ninth house. And the sun in Virgo is obviously somebody, again, who has this very strong sense of duty and commitment. And in this case, I think also, we have to acknowledge that he's born into this. It's not his choice. He's going to have to learn this as he goes, and we'll see how that affects him. The sun is very nicely in harmony with the moon, and so it does show a certain balance to his personality as well. It shows a kind of a psychological, being okay inside psychologically, although he does show quite a lot of mental stress, mental and emotional stress. But at least initially, he had a good solid foundation psychologically. And so at least as a child, that supported his sense of self quite strongly. The sun in the ninth house shows the importance of the father, for good or bad. And that will always show the importance of the father and how connections are with the father. We can see that there is a certain amount of tension with the father, again, as I mentioned, because of that Saturn and midheaven. We see challenges with the father in the chart because the sun is also squaring Mars. And that's very tricky because it means that a lot of times there's an obstacle to progress. There's an obstacle to what we want to achieve. We've seen that in his life panning out in a lot of different ways. And then that also shows up as a challenge, with the father, challenging relationship with the father. That also happens to be a square with Neptune. The sun is squaring Neptune, and that can also be an indicator of low self-esteem. This is showing up in a number of different ways in the chart. So that's one of them. When the sun and Neptune are in a challenging aspect to one another, it's very difficult to find one's way. difficult to decide on a career, for example, difficult to just kind of find one's path, especially independent of the family. That's another one of the meanings of Saturn on the midheaven. There can be this sense that you're duty bound to the parents, or duty bound to your culture or to your society and those expectations. Of course, he's a prince, and so this is what we see in his life. And so it's difficult for him to carve his way independent of those expectations. Interestingly, his father's sun is at 24 Scorpio as well. So although it's not making a direct hit on this, it's actually opposing his natal moon. So there's definitely a lot of connection there between the sun, his son, so Prince Charles' son, and his son Harry's moon. And so I think there is actually originally, at least in the early days, an affection, a real affection for him. But of course, that's not always necessarily going to be easy in this kind of chart. This is a chart of somebody who has a lot of complications. I have to say, there's some charts that just flow, where life just kind of flows, and Harry's doesn't flow. Harry's got a lot of struggle. It's built in also, even just the fact that he has a Virgo sun and a Capricorn ascendant that symbolizes already a feeling of anxiety and stress. It's kind of baked in to the individual. That applies to anyone. It's not just Harry's. That Virgo and Capricorn, that combination of Saturn ruling Capricorn and Mercury ruling Virgo. By the way, his Mercury is very strong in Virgo. I'll get to that in a moment, but it does create a certain amount of anxiety and tension in the individual, sort of baked in. And so there's a sense also in the clan of having to override emotions through the intellect, and this really doesn't work for Harry. So it's there. It's an underlying thing in this symbolism of the sun and the ascendant. It's there in the clan. Be rational, don't be emotional, and also a feeling of intellectual inferiority that runs in the family, interestingly. I know that his mother often described herself as somebody who was not very bright. She was not educated. She left school without going to university, for example. And I know that certainly that showed up in the era, in the 80s, when she was really, really famous. That was actually quite spoken about. I'm old enough to remember that on the news, because of course she was also on the news almost every single day. So even if you're not a royalist, you literally can't get away from these things if you are an English-speaking reader or observer of the news. Yeah, this is not easy, I have to say. I do feel a lot of sympathy for him. There is also with Virgo and Capricorn together, that sun and ascendant combo, there is this feeling of needing to sacrifice. There's a sacrifice and a sense of lack of worthiness in work. Am I good enough? Am I up to this task? So if any of you have this, I'd love to hear from you. If you've got that combination, and see how that shows up for you, or if you know somebody who has that combination, because it's something that is kind of an undercurrent that's like coming through the family, that is the person is born into this energy. There, of course, can also be a certain preoccupation with health and illness. And in Harry's chart, we see that in a very powerful way, because his sixth house contains his north node, which is conjunct Chiron. Again, it's a big conjunction. I give up to 10 degrees in a natal chart. That will always keep my interest. And of course, the tighter, the more compelling. But this is still an interesting 7, almost 8 degree conjunction. And in the sixth house of health and illness, and that Chiron is conjunct Aldebaran. So that's showing something quite strong, because that Aldebaran is a royal star, and so there's a pain attached to his role in that sense of service in the sixth house, about service and health and well-being, but also mental health. And And he seems to be struggling with his mental health. He's very open, apparently, about talking about his therapist. And again, I'm gleaning this from news reports. So if you know better or if you know more, do let me know in the comments below. But I'm taking what I'm gleaning from news articles and things that I use to try and understand what he's experiencing, especially because he seems to be really in a challenging phase of his life. I mean, I'll show the transits shortly. But look at this is the theme of his life. So we've got very much a need for him to understand this role, understand his capacity for healing. And Gemini, of course, will very much come through the notion of mind. The axis of body mind, of course, is the 6th and 12th house. Gemini with regards more to the thinking process, to the need to heal our manner of thinking, our manner of communicating. He's got a good mind, I think, intellectually. So although he may feel inferior, of course, if you're comparing to other people, that always might be a difficult comparison. It's not that he is actually not intelligent. I think he is. I think the thing is his communication, and Gemini is also about that. It's communication that is a problem for him, a feeling of not being understood. And he has that in spades. This is another aspect of that Saturn, a kind of a petulance, this kind of feeling of woe is me. And that Saturn in the 11th, that kind of just general grouchiness and dissatisfaction can also push people away. So there's, on the one hand, there's not many people around him that he feels he can count on. We also see in the house of hidden enemies, we've got a lot of planets there. I'll describe what they all mean shortly, but there's a genuine sense that he's not really safe around others. And so this is challenging because he pushes people away almost from that unconscious expectation of challenge, the expectation of problems. And of course that Mars there is ruling Saturn. Mars Saturn is really challenging. That's a semi-sextile. Mars and Saturn in semi-sextile is awkward. It's tense. So that Saturn in the 11th is, like I mentioned earlier, some disappointments in friendships, or, there you can lose money or reputation. And, he's got the ruler of that in the 12th house of loss. And so there's almost it's almost impossible to avoid losing something, reputation or money or something, through friends, through acquaintances, potentially through business dealings as well. Saturn in Scorpio in general is somebody who's very acquisitive, somebody who wants to accumulate wealth and fame and fortune and all that stuff. So it's a motivator, somebody who's really driven. They can be really successful people. I'm not suggesting here that he doesn't have any capacity to be successful. On the contrary, it's just that he's got a hard road to get through the success, to get to where he wants to go. So that's part of his life's struggle, very much. There's that focus on dealing with the hidden aspects of life is very much here. This, like the fears. 12th house Mars is fear of loss, even again that unconscious thing that was coming again through that Saturn ruling the 2nd. So I want to see these things several times. I want things to be repeated again and again before I'm really sure that these are the indications, because things can have different meanings according to how things show up in repetition. But this message is showing up again and again. Fear of loss, insecurity around one's social position, insecurity around money, insecurity around one's self. And so this is something that I think he is dealing with, grappling with on a regular basis. And that he's definitely working hard to keep himself on track according to him. He's working very, very hard. It's much, much more challenging for someone like him than anybody else to succeed in their own right, with their own life path carved out, because he seems to have an enormous amount of obstacles in front of him. And this is a semi-sextile that's not an easy energy, because it's like these planets don't see each other, and yet that planet we've got Mars ruling that Saturn, so it figures very importantly. It rules the midheaven as well. It figures very, very importantly. It's ruling Pluto as well at 0 degrees, right, entering into Scorpio at a very, very powerful degree point in a powerful position for Pluto. And so again, that Pluto is reinforcing the message of Saturn, which is all about the desire to succeed in public, the desire to succeed at one's goals, having a certain amount of drive and power and ambition, and yet at the same time also it's very much to do with a feeling of not fitting in. And there's such an intensity with Pluto and Saturn in the 11th house. There's such an intensity around wanting to fit in, wanting to be capable of, belonging, and never really fully achieving that. And again, it's going to come through different expressions. He has the capacity to achieve many, many things, but it will always come through a little bit skewed. It's never going to be graceful or easy for him. He has this Pluto also in a sextile with Jupiter, which is a very important indicator of wealth. But again, because that Jupiter is not in really good dignity, it means that there's some tension around wealth. There's some struggle around money, around wealth. And Jupiter is also, of course, representative of our wisdom and our capacity to guide ourselves well. And he's got a trine with Jupiter and Mercury, so he does have good wisdom. He's got, some really a good head on his shoulders, as it were. But unfortunately, he's deeply impulsive as well and deeply emotional. We'll get to that in a moment. And I think that emotionality is what is blocking him, and it prevents him from actually being able to do the right thing. So he knows what the right thing is, but then he overreacts or he gets excited about things and shoots himself in the foot. So that's that Mars in Sagittarius. Even by itself, I would say, okay. And that would be also somebody who would very, very much sort of blurt out things. That Uranus is actually squaring that Mercury, so that is already an indication that there can be a tendency to kind of blurt things out and sort of regret what you said or regret how you communicated something. And certainly with that Uranus conjunct Mars, there's an explosive temperament. That's that Mars in semi-sextile to Saturn, an explosive temperament. Sun rather, which is in a square to that Mars, and that is an explosive temperament. We have Mars, which is in conjunct the Moon, which is a challenging moodiness and temperament that is really unpredictable, that makes him very difficult to be around. So there's a lot of inner turmoil, and as much as Venus is giving him this lovely grace in many ways, social graces, he loves people. He's super with people. He really loves to connect. We can see that. Venus in the 10th, especially in such good dignity, is a person who loves to be connected with people. He genuinely enjoys people. You can see that also with the Sun and the Moon, this connection here, this very harmonious trine in a very close, like less than 2 degrees of separation. It's like 1.5 degrees. And that's another indicator of somebody who's a real people person. And even Mercury in the 9th also could talk anybody's leg off. It could sit down next to anybody and really enjoy talking to people. So these are indicators of a person who is socially graceful, socially easy, has all the right graces, but internally is deeply conflicted. The 12th house can also show up very much our sense of unconscious turmoil, unconscious challenges. So that, again, there's so much to say about this chart, but I'm going to have to cut it short just to be concise, because otherwise we could go on forever. But just to say that also Uranus is in this opposition to Chiron. This is a whole generation. It's more than a generation. It's 40 years of people. I have it myself. I was born in the mid-60s. If you were born from 1952 until 1989, that whole group of people for almost 40 years has Uranus opposite Chiron, because they kept tracking each other for so long. Of course, it's a question of degree. So some people will have a very wide opposition. Some people will have a very tight opposition, and Harry happens to have a very tight opposition. Nonetheless, it's a thing. It's a feature from the 1950s all the way through the 1980s. And that symbolism is very much about this tension between tradition and the past. In Harry's case, with Sagittarius, it's very much also about dogma, religious dogma, about what we believe. And then this expression of that in Chiron. And so Chiron Uranus will always create a tension between the way the person wants to act, sometimes being quite conservative, quite, uniform in the way that they approach things, and at other times being quite rebellious. And Harry's got a strong rebellious streak. So he has Uranus not only in Sagittarius, which is quite rebellious anyway, but also it's on Antares. And so that is something that is also very much to do with this Jupiterian energy, this kind of Mars-Jupiter energy of bigger, larger than life energy that is about radical restlessness and change and so on. Antares has to be conjunct within a degree or two maximum to be really noticed in a chart. We really shouldn't look at things that are in a broad conjunction. It doesn't apply to the fixed stars. But the Uranus and Mars conjunction is still, for me, in application. Even though it's about a 7-degree conjunction, it's still going to be very effective. And in the same way, then we also have Mars in opposition to Chiron in the same intensity. So there's a lot to say here about how he is very emotionally impulsive, very conflicted around tradition, conflicted around his desire to be different, to be free. Uranus is always about freedom, and so is Sagittarius. And in the 12th house, it's like, let me escape. The 12th house is literally the house of escape, and trying to disappear, trying to move on. And then he's got this Neptune there, which is also suggesting that he's not necessarily very clear. He might be under certain illusions about things. We do see that showing up in a number of other aspects of his chart. So Mars is also in a semi-square with Pluto in the chart. So that's something that is quite significant as well. Mars in semi-square adds to these challenging emotions and this intensity, this volatility that he has. It's hard to control, and it can be violent. So there are a lot of aspects in the chart that suggest that he himself is provocative and aggressive. And what happens with Pluto, Mars-Pluto aspects like this, is that it tends to bring out the worst in a person when they're emotionally provoked. And so what happens is either people are attracted to them who are wishing them ill or who are aggressive, or the person themselves is aggressive. And so that's something that he may not be aware of, because all of this is hidden, really, unconscious stuff. I think he seems to be in therapy, so he's maybe learning about that. But, working therapeutically with astrology just accelerates the self-awareness. It accelerates the understanding. I really appreciate so many psychologists who use some form of astrology in their practice with people, because it just helps them go really quickly into the root of the problem. And here, this is something that he would possibly be unconscious of, because Pluto is also part of our unconscious drive. It's unconscious fears and unconscious urges that we need to understand. So quite challenging in many, many ways. One of the other aspects of this, with this tension between Mars and Saturn and Mars and Pluto, the influence of Neptune is adding to this issue, is that he's not likely to listen to advice. We'll see this with the book launch, whether he took anybody's advice, because it is something that he feels, especially in Sagittarius, Mars in Sagittarius, is already pretty convinced by their opinions, pretty strong in their beliefs. And of course, notice that that's his tendency. He's got the South Node there. Ketu is there. That means he's already coming in with this attitude. And the attitude he needs to learn is listen, communicate, understand. The Gemini energy. It's can we talk about this? And Sagittarius says, no, I know exactly what you're going to say. Why bother talking? And so that Mars in Sag is it can be very dogmatic, and so can that pairing, this semi-sextile with Saturn. And it's a challenge. It's a very big challenge for him. And that very energy is affecting his public image on the midheaven. And when we have that challenging energy of Saturn in challenge with Mars on the midheaven, and it's a very powerful Mars semi-sextile, the midheaven almost to the degree, to within a few arc minutes of a degree. That is going to bring about challenges with people's opinions of you. So it's rare that a person with Saturn on the midheaven is a really popular person. They can be admired, they can be respected, and can be seen as an elder or a senior if they earn their chops, later on in life, usually not in early life. But it's very rare that that person is like, oh, really popular, like everybody's favorite. So yeah, personal success is absolutely possible, but again, it comes through a lot of having to work hard and having to eat humble pie. That's another Saturn on the midheaven is about learning hard lessons, having to eat humble pie. Mars in Sagittarius is not really about humble pie. So it's a big lesson, big lesson for him. Mars in Sagittarius is a risk taker. It's somebody who is adventurous, who loves to, he's very enthusiastic about life in the same way that typically a Jupiter in the first house can be as well. And it's an explorer. It's somebody who loves to discover things, especially with that Sun in the ninth and Mercury in the ninth house. Exploring, understanding new horizons, new belief systems, and so on. It's really a very good place for somebody with Mars in Sag. And the other part of that is that he was a soldier, and this is excellent for a soldier. This is almost like archetypally a soldier. Mars in Sag is about fighting the good fight. Feeling that there's a purpose and a drive to what you're doing, and then of course Saturn and Mars are warriors. The combination of Saturn and Mars in almost any aspect denotes some kind of warrior energy, particularly when we're talking about Mars ruling Saturn. And particularly when we're talking about Mars ruling the midheaven, it's very much about the military. And I think that was where he really shone. It seems like the one time in his life where he earned respect in a very legitimate way was he did apparently 3 tours in Afghanistan in the British Army. So I think he did probably thrive in that energy, and he's probably not been able to find those bearings ever since. But I know he also does work, and again, the 12th house is all about hospitals and places of confinement and loss and all these other aspects, but it's also working with people who are experiencing that. And I know he started a charity for wounded soldiers, and that has done something quite extraordinary. Apparently it's super successful. He's even done these kind of, I think that, what's it called? Invictus Games, which are for wounded soldiers. It's kind of like an Olympics for soldiers who are wounded, and just allowing them to compete and show up in life in a positive and self-affirming way. So he's got this. This is a very inspiring energy too. Mars and Sag can be super inspired. And this is and especially with that energy of Uranus and then Neptune finding, spiritual inspiration, almost like religious inspiration coming into that Mars. And so, again, it's not really close, but it's still in the 12th house. And so it's still describing that situation. Again, the challenge is that the ruler of all of this is not in great shape. Just as the ruler of his ascendant is not in great shape. And so that will always describe something a little bit, not really, really working in the way that one would hope. So the 12th house, I don't want to overemphasize this, but it's definitely something to keep in mind because he's going through a lot right now. And I think this is part of his waking up moment in life. He's very much having to deal with the issues of the 12th house, which are loss of reputation. Mars in the 12th can really trigger a loss of reputation. It's about secret or hidden enemies. It's really important with a person for anyone with a Mars in the 12th house, regardless of sign, that you live in the highest integrity or you will lose. There's no way that you won't. And the same particularly is true with Uranus there. Same problem. If you have Uranus in the 12th house, you've got to live along the straight and narrow, and otherwise you are going to fall on your face, and at best that will be behind the scenes or, in some personal endeavor that you're doing. But in Harry's case, it's going to be very public. And so his solution to this is to live with integrity. And that integrity also means to be honest, to be absolutely scrupulously honest. Now, I have to say, Mars in the 12th doesn't really inspire honesty. Uranus and Mercury, although it's great for insightfulness and inventiveness and so on, does not necessarily lead to honesty as well. So this is something to keep in mind. It's not so much dishonesty as in I want to deceive. It's more that there's a lack of awareness. Like it's a lack of understanding of self and a desire to be seen in a particular way. I think in Harry's case, very strongly, it's about being seen as a victim. Neptune in the 12th house, very, very powerful energy of victim. Same thing with Chiron in the 6th house, and then especially in Gemini, Chiron conjunct the North Node. This is very much about this wounding around his siblings as well, around how he speaks, how he's showing up. Is it really honest? This is something he's going to have to be really scrupulous about. I heard yesterday some snippets, which was why I decided to do this thing. I heard snippets of interviews that he did around this book publication, and it was a lot about what other people were doing to him. At least maybe that was just the snippets that were trying to draw our attention to this, but I didn't hear a whole lot of self-reflection. There's a whole lot of blame. And we definitely get that blame in other aspects of the chart. So that's also that, again, we're seeing somebody who is not really sure of himself, who is easy to be misled in many ways. Also, we see that because the moon is on the IC, so the Imam Chelai is the nadir of the chart. That's home and family, even if we're finding that in the 5th house because I'm using the whole sign houses. And so that moon is, in opposition to the midheaven, and it's, of course, conjunct the nadir of the chart. And, of course, the moon represents the 7th house for him, so relationships. But either way, even if it didn't, the moon is very much influenced by other people's opinions in a situation like this. When it's in the lowest part of the chart, the moon is referring to other people, for his self-esteem, for his self-image. Am I okay? Am I good enough? This is another kind of fatal flaw in the sense that as a result of that, then this becomes even more significant, that it can be more easily taken advantage of because he doubts himself. We see that also with the Neptune squaring the Sun and Neptune in the 12th as well. That Neptune is also in conjunct the Sun. So again, it's awkward energy. It's a broad in conjunction. So I'm being very generous with these orbs just because it's referring back to the same problem. So I'd say this is not like the fundamental problem of his chart, but it's always worth noticing where things don't feel comfortable for the person that you're looking at. This is why I'm doing these things. It's because when we use a famous person's chart, it's not so much to probe into their life. It's not the point of what I'm doing here. It's to show how astrology can demonstrate aspects of an individual. So for me, being able to see a person who's almost in real time having life experiences and that we are somehow privy to that, it helps us to understand astrology. It helps us to learn. And so this is why I'm explaining this through his chart. Otherwise, I wish him well. I think he's got a pretty challenging road. And of course, it's not all about money. People are like, oh, he's so wealthy. Why is he complaining? The truth is, of course, we have to realize that money never buys happiness, right? It's only the immaterial things that are going to make us happy, and money and palaces and all that other stuff. None of it matters if you don't have love and happiness in your life. So again, we find that general discontent. The message is repeated again and again and again. This general discontent with life. Jupiter in Capricorn is kind of grumpy. It's like, oh, for God's sake, nothing ever works out in my favor. It's never good enough. I'm the spare. I'm not the heir. There is an enormous amount of resentment in this chart. It's kind of baked into the chart. So It's one of the things he's here to learn to overcome, learning to overcome these emotional and psychological challenges. Sixth house, North Node in Gemini, and especially connected to Chiron. It's very much his lesson. And another aspect of his life lessons is to distinguish between, that capacity to assert oneself, because if we have Sun square Mars, it can be very good for self-assertion, but there has to be a distinction between assertion and aggression. And with this Mars, it feels a lot more like aggression. He hasn't really been able to find his way towards asserting himself without being aggressive about it. And we even see that publicly. So I can't even imagine what it must be like privately. And that, of course, that same thing applies. The Sun in square with Neptune is quite self-pitying. It's very much not seeing clearly. That Sun square Neptune is being delusional even. It can lead to all kinds of aspects of self-denial. And again, it's another emphasis of being overly people-pleasing as well. We were talking earlier about the moon on the IC, and that Neptune and Sun aspect in square can be, again, another indicator of being overly people-pleasing, bending too much to other people's desires and wills, and not really being able to feel like one can stand up for oneself. And again, this is coming back from the whole childhood thing, where he's not really allowed to live the life that he wants to live. That Saturn midheaven connection, big frustration in his life. And sextiling the Ascendant, that plays a huge role in his personal experience. It's a ruler, Ascendant ruler sextiling the Ascendant from a place of really grumpy dignity, not a happy place. So it's very difficult for him to find a firm grounding as an adult. He's got a weak sense of self, and I think this is what's happening right now. He's trying to build that, but he's doing it through some kind of very public display of his emotionality, and we see that he's very emotional. The North Node actually is also conjunct the moon, and so again, it's an out of sign conjunction. The node is just about to move into Taurus in his chart, and so we see this really intense connection with the North Node and the moon there. And the North Node and the moon is another message about needing to come to terms with one's psychological and emotional challenges. It's a big life theme. Your emotional nature is very, very prominent. And of course, that becomes even more impactful the closer they are by degree. This is 9 degrees off or just about. It's a big, wide conjunction, but because the nodes are all about the moon, that's the whole point of the nodes, is what they designate the eclipses. So we have to take that very seriously. So moon and node relationships are always going to provoke an individual emotionally. And of course that comes with the symbolism of mother. So moon in Taurus in the 5th house is a lovely energy for a moon, and that is symbolic of his mother. We see the mother in the moon in a native's chart, and we see that his mother played an enormous role in terms of him feeling secure. Much less so the father, who probably felt much more like a nitpicker, somebody who he was much less comfortable with, this we know. But nonetheless, the father, I do believe, genuinely loved him, with his son opposing the moon. Yeah, we do have, and the other aspect becomes, because of that trine, we see that the parents genuinely have a great deal of affection for this child. Yeah, the moon in the 5th house carries its own challenges. So again, Harry has this joyful way of living. That's one aspect of the moon in the 5th. Can be very self-indulgent, especially in Taurus. This is a moon that is opposite the midheaven again, so that's going to be again a person who tends to bend to the will of other people, but it can also lead to a person being a bit irresponsible. So I think that's less the case for him, because he does have this Capricorn ascendant, very heavy sense of duty and responsibility, and the moon, of course, is in Taurus, which is a pretty grounded place for the moon. But in general, the moon in the fifth house is a very, very changeable, emotionally up and down, very dramatic emotions, like, drama queen kind of thing. We've seen that elsewhere in the chart. We see other very big dramatic, through the Pluto and Mars, through the Mars and Sun, etc., etc. We see all this drama, and then we see that with the moon as well in the fifth house. So, yeah. So if you have the moon in the fifth, you know, you know what other people are thinking about you. Your drama queen nature is the price to be paid for having this wonderfully bubbly, inspiring person to hang out with. But that also makes a person extremely good with children, actually wanting children, very, very creative, as well, very sort of happy and young, youthful, with Mercury in Virgo in a very good dignity in the ninth house as well. That's another way of expressing him as a youthful, happy-go-lucky kind of countenance. But again, that's not his emotional experience, that's his social experience. But yeah, he's definitely a very emotive person. So he does also have a really strong Venus. It's an angular Venus. So his Jupiter is angular. That means it's in the first house. So the first, fourth, seventh, and 10th houses are the angular houses. And they give an extra kind of pillar of strength to the chart and to the planets. Now he's got benefics on two of the four angles, which is really, really lovely. I mean, again, it shows you that he was born into ease. When the benefics are on the angles, it's a kind of a leg up. It's a cosmic leg up in life. So very clearly, if you're born in a palace, that's a good start to life. Venus in the 10th describes also the people he spends time with. They're beneficial people, people of high standing, and that includes the spouse, for example, that you would find and this would apply whether it be a man or a woman, because Venus is the relationship. And so that relationship would be somebody who is in the public eye, somebody in public standing. So his wife is an actress, and that is independent of people's opinions of her. She's somebody who had a certain degree of public standing. And so that's something that he's kind of meriting in this life. That's considered punya, that's a boon. It's a grace that he gets in this time around, having a wife who is charming and in social standing. And of course, Venus rules that moon in Taurus. And although now we see that Venus is in an inconjunct, it's still the ruler of the moon. And this is one of the reasons that the Taurus moon is so happy. It's because Venus rules that moon. But Venus is, although in very good dignity, she is in an inconjunct with that moon, just to within about 3.5 degrees. And an inconjunct between Venus and the moon shows real challenges with women, real challenges with relationships, in emotional relationships. And that doesn't mean that's not possible, doesn't mean the relationship is not possible. It just means that it is a challenge. It means it's something that is going to be causing difficulty, or it's a hurdle, or is something to always have to grapple with. It doesn't sort of flow. We also see that Venus is in a lovely sextile to Mars. Venus sextile Mars is very, very social, very happy-go-lucky again, very passionate, inspired, all the things that are really positive about Venus-Mars connecting in this very tight, positive sextile as well. So it's within a degree. That's a really very, very key feature. But, the two of them are forming this challenge. It's this sextile Venus and Mars are both in conjunct the moon. That's what's called a yod, and that's this challenging aspect. So the moon is the solution to the challenge, and that tells us once again that his life sort of purpose, or one of his aims in life, is to understand his emotional self, understand emotions and connections to his mind. The moon is also the mind. It's emotions are within the mind, and understanding that deeper feeling nature and what that means to him through Venus and Mars. We also see with that moon on the IC that his family, for good or bad in his case, and I do think there was a lot of good in that, in a dignified moon like that, his family is going to play a significant role for his whole life, independent of the sign that the moon is in. If the moon is on the IC, it's always going to show that the family has an enormous influence on the individual. And of course, that's in an emotional and psychological manner. So we see that Uranus is, again, broadly conjunct the South Node, and that is going to be a kind of the counter story to this Chiron North Node tale, which is very much about healing and wanting to be, it's almost an obsessive need to heal. This is an energy of rebellion, an energy of frustration, and this intensity around wanting change, wanting things to be different. But what happens is when Chiron is on the North Node, in fact, almost whenever any planet is on the North Node, and then we see the moon giving us the emotional quality on the other side of that, there is a tendency to kind of crave that experience of healing, wanting to heal, but always falling back on the South Node pattern. So kind of failing in the mission, as it were, until we get it right. It's not that he's never going to get it right, but that there's a tendency to kind of go really far overboard. And I think this is where things are starting to go a bit pear-shaped for him, because he's becoming so public about it that he's not kind of allowing himself the space to heal. He's putting everything out in the sort of the court of public opinion, and taking all of this rebelliousness, all of this hidden anger and rebelliousness that he's got there, and spewing it out. But this is an old pattern. And again, that pattern of victimization is showing up in the story as well, even if it's not exactly opposite all of this, but it's still part of the story. So he's certainly with that energy, that rebellious energy and the South Node energy, he definitely wants to be the center of attention. And it's more like through tantrums that he's the center of attention rather than through any particular good deed. And so again, he's shooting himself in the foot here. This urge to be seen, this drama queen kind of energy that he's pulling out of this Venus, Mars, and Moon Yod. That's not an easy thing to live privately, let alone publicly. Okay, so I think we're ready to move on now. I want to bring in the chart for his book release, which is what prompted me to do this in the first place, because as I heard about it, I thought, I wonder how this is going to go, because I don't even think you need to be an astrologer to see that this is not going to be great for him. But now that we're seeing it through the lens of astrology, we can see that this is not going to be great for him. So let's see why. So for the book release, I'm using the 10th of January. I understand it's going to be released, but I didn't know where. So often these publications are done in New York and London for English books. And so what I did was I gave midnight for New York, which is 5:00 a.m. London time on the 10th of January. So I'm not sure that that's exactly when it's going to happen, but let's say, in the days of Amazon book releases, it's automatic. It's like midnight on the day, rather than a bookstore opening at 9 a.m. or whatever. So this is what we're going with. It may not be exact, but it doesn't matter, because most of the planets, with the exception of, a few degrees of the moon, will be the same. I'm assuming that the moon will keep its position here. And that's quite important because it tells part of the story. So where do we begin? Well, let's have a look. First of all, we want to see the first house, what's going on, because that's all about Harry. And of course, there's a lot going on. This is a chart I would describe as what not to do when you want to release something important. I would say that this is something that is just so challenging in so many ways. And if anybody had any idea of astrology, you would have picked literally any other day but this one. Really now. We've got Mercury, which is ruling publications, especially his natal Mercury up there in the 9th house is very powerful for that, very good for publications. Especially, Mercury ruling Virgo. It's a very good Mercury he's got there. Now, this Mercury is retrograde on the Ascendant and not in a great place for Mercury. It's not a bad place, but it's Mercury in Capricorn. So it's going to call up all of the issues that he has around money that we saw before. One of the things, I'm not sure if I mentioned this or may have mentioned it in past passing. But one of the things that stands out with Jupiter in Capricorn, and in the first house particularly, is that there's a sense of not being taken seriously, a struggle to be taken seriously. That can translate as people become very jolly, they're very happy-go-lucky, very happy to, hang out with people and so on. They're like the joker of the gang. But they struggle to be taken seriously, and particularly in Capricorn, this is something that is a big wound for him, for all the reasons we just saw in the natal chart. Now, the thing is that he will take himself very seriously, because in relationship to himself, he takes himself very, very seriously. And we see that in a lot of the different ways that he communicates in the media. So all of this energy of Mercury retrograde, not in great dignity, and then the Sun in the first house, and then Pluto in the first house, all of that is calling in this essential sense of self, right? It's right there, and very, very significant. So we know that this will be personally very significant for him. This is inescapable. Now, of course, he's had Pluto going through that first house since the very end of 2007, and that's been changing him. It's been transforming his personality, his way of being. It's basically his whole adult experience, essentially, because how old would he have been? He would have been in his 20s. So then that would be something that he's changed enormously in these 14 years or so. That continues because, of course, we've got Pluto going back and forth over his first and second houses for 2023 and 2024. So he's going to be coming back to learn this lesson again and again and again. It'll come back in June. So after having gone at the end of March, going into the second house, it's going to come back into the first house from June till the end of the year. So this issue around who am I, what am I made of, and then the issues around money. This big question around money is there. Now, again, if we're looking at this not only just from his perspective, but in terms of a book launch, I think that is also quite significant, because we have also this connection here. It's a trine, solar trine, which is quite good. That's quite nice because it's emphasizing himself, and they're going back into the house of publication with his natal sun, so that can be quite supportive, quite good, especially as it's ruled by Mercury, except now this Mercury by transit is not in good dignity, so it's going to be mitigated. I think it's not going to be as good as it could be, but also that Pluto is trining the sun. And that Pluto trine the sun is going to be powerfully transformational. So I'm not sure how he's going to take this, but with that, and then on top of all of the other aspects that are being made in terms of Pluto and other planets, I think this is something that's going to change his life. Now, again, it's a huge, that's a very wide margin. I'm just saying that because it's Pluto and it's in his first house. And I wouldn't do that with any other planet, but we have a lot of tighter orbs with Pluto, including Pluto being semi-sextile, this very pesky Neptune that's in the 12th house. So Pluto semi-sextile Neptune goes all the way from February 2022 till October 2024. That's very much about confusion, about your purpose in life, the meaning of life, the purpose of life. Why am I here? It's very personal to him, not just because it's the semi-sextile, which would have that questioning anyway, but it's because the Neptune in Sag adds to that energy. And it's ruled by Jupiter in his first house, and that Pluto by transit is in his first house. This is very personal. This is all about, what am I here for? And this is the essence of 2022, 2023, and 2024 for him, very, very powerfully. He's building up to a square with his natal Pluto. And Pluto square Pluto is a revolutionary time in life. It's a very, very big change. It changes virtually everything about oneself. It's something of an overhaul that can be really welcome. It's very invigorating, and it can be something that is exactly what is needed. And on a cosmic level, we could say it's exactly what is needed, but it's very painful. And he's going to have this transition going back and forth for the next 2 years. So, but that's baked into this book launch as well. And that is a very tight orb. That's a 2-degree orb. So again, from the point of view of the book sales, we want to look at the second house of income. So in general, it's good to have Venus in the house of income if you're trying to do anything that's really helpful. It will bring you money for sure. I think that's kind of guaranteed. But Saturn is also there. So there's some challenge with that. There's some backlash or delay or payback. Saturn is very strong. And Saturn is ruling this Venus here in the second house. And of course, Saturn rules his ascendant as well. And lo and behold, that Saturn is also sextiling Neptune. As if it weren't enough, we also have Venus, which is squaring his midheaven and Saturn. Now, again, these are really broad squares. This is something that happens over time, which means that in the days following the book release, they will square. They will be exact. And so the week following, let's say, give it a week roughly, this launch is going to be really, really challenging for him. More to the point, Venus is actually squaring the nodes on that day. So again, if you're looking for days to do stuff that you want to be harmonious, don't let anything square the nodes, because it's not going to work out the way that you wanted. And the nodes are going to bring you something that you deserve, but you didn't want to necessarily confront. And Venus is ruling this north node. So again, very significant. So there's something here that is really impactful. The south node being very important to him because it's passing over that midheaven, Saturn and Pluto, in his 11th house of the public opinion and how he greets the public, but also his goals and ambitions in life. Venus squaring that. And then Venus squaring the 5th house, that is very much about his creativity, his sense of joy, his sense of entrepreneurship as well. So I wouldn't have wanted Venus squaring the nodes for any kind of launch like that. But clearly, he's not listening to anybody, certainly not an astrologer. So I think here, to come back to his natal issues around not having very close friends and then not really listening to people, choosing to go his own way and kind of putting his foot in it before realizing it's too late. I think if he genuinely had good friends, if he had a good circle around him and people who genuinely cared about him, as opposed to people who are trying to take advantage of him, probably for their own financial gain, whether it be a book publishing company or whatever. But if he had good advice, I don't think he would be advised to do this project. And that's independent of the astrology. But it just reinforces to me that he doesn't have people in his life that are looking out for his best interest. Or the people who are, he's not listening to. And probably both are true. So we want to keep in mind that Venus in the 2nd house, squaring the nodes, is also ruling the 10th house, and it's the 10th house Venus as well. So it will definitely show up in his house of career, his house of what he's doing in the world. It's definitely going to show up. Now, it's a trine, so that's also very supportive. But again, given that for the rest it's quite mitigated, I'm not sure he's going to get the results that he wanted. And that Venus, again, is, with regards to Saturn, is dependent on that Saturn. Saturn is ruling that Venus, and that's not necessarily going to bring the results that one would hope. And if we come again back to the Venus in terms of challenging aspects, it's a Venus trine Chiron. Now, that can be, again, him spilling the beans about his relationships and his emotions and so on. But guess who's right on top of Chiron? And that's Mars. Mars is so slow at this point. It's about to station direct on his retrograde Chiron. So Mars is still retrograde at this point and has been since the 20th of December pretty much on this point. So Mars has been hammering down on his natal Chiron and in opposition to his natal Uranus from the 20th of December all the way through the 7th of February. And that's really significant because the last time that happened, so Mars opposing Uranus, Mars in conjunction with this Chiron, it happened the first time when Mars was going direct. And that was between the 3rd and the 11th of September. And his grandmother, the Queen, died on the 8th of September. And the exact date for that opposition was the 7th of September. So just to give you a sense of what is going to happen on this day, I think it's going to be the emotional equivalent of this huge loss of his grandmother. I think it will certainly call back, this is the second journey now, call back all of the pain and suffering that was surrounding that death, even though, of course, it was expected. She was elderly, but because the family seemed to have been fragmented and he certainly felt isolated, this is going to call it all back in. And remember, this is the original wound. This is him trying to figure out his childhood, trying to figure out his capacity to speak up for himself, trying to figure out how to live without being a rebel, without throwing a wrench into everything. This is tricky stuff. This is very, very tricky stuff. I think he's going to find that day emotionally very, very challenging. I honestly wish the best for him because I think that this could be very, very hard to bear. This is the 6th house. This is really heavy emotional stuff. And I think he's going to have, he's going to be biting off quite a lot here. And speaking of biting off a lot, he's got at the same time Jupiter, which is squaring his natal Jupiter. That's another way of saying biting off more than you can chew. And that already happened. That was the aspect that he's had already since May, so since the middle of May of 2022. He definitely already was experiencing that, and that really extends until the end of January. It's exact on the 17th of January, so within a week of this book being published, he's going to have the exact square of Jupiter to his natal Jupiter, and that is really symbolic of, oh man, I think I've done too much. That Jupiter is in conjunct the 9th house of publishing Mercury that's there as it's squaring. So it's a tricky aspect. I mean, honest to God, you can't make this stuff up. It's just like the recipe for the wrong thing to do. Jupiter is on the IC, and as we saw earlier with the moon planets on the IC, always reflect what's going on internally, emotionally, psychologically, and so on, but especially with regards to the family. In this particular case, then this also translates directly into the 4th house, so it's adding that deeper 4th house dimension, whereas his natal IC is in the 5th house, because it floats around when you do a whole sign. So the Sun, which is in his 1st house, is also squaring this natal Venus. So the Sun squaring natal Venus is going to provoke some kind of issues around creative and financial projects. So Venus is finance, it's creativity, it's beauty, it's all of the arts. And it's certainly with regards to his career, it's going to be a relationship and career hit, and potentially around money as well. This is connected to, how he's showing up. The Sun also represents ourselves in our career, the way that we're showing up, but in the chart more than anything. But here, when we square it up with Venus, it's highlighting that because Venus is in the 10th house of vocation, career, or your social status. And so although it raises awareness around that, it's certainly going to be a very public thing. Awareness both within himself, but also with people around him in terms of relationships. But it's not going to be comfortable. It's going to be really, really challenging. I think he's going to regret doing this. I think that's an easy call. I think that's a kind of understatement. We have to see also that Uranus is opposing his natal Saturn, and that has been for quite a while now. So Uranus has been in opposition to his Saturn because it's so slow and going back and forth. It's been since May 2021. And that seems like that's when everything really went pear-shaped, although maybe it was before that. But anyway, since May 2021, it's been strongly opposing his Saturn, and it goes all the way till the 6th of May, and the coronation is on the 5th, and there's an eclipse on the night of the 4th to the 5th of May. So this again is his sort of original pain around authority, around his role in the world and so on, and Uranus is kind of questioning all that. It's putting such a lot of tension and pressure on that. it's very much indicative of this kind of stress and desire to change one's way of life, one's way of expressing oneself in one's career and so on, and just in general. But the big message here with Uranus opposing Saturn, and keep this in mind if you also have Uranus opposing Saturn, if you're one of those with Saturn in Scorpio, or anytime you have Uranus opposing Saturn, the big message would be don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because the tendency is to have this feeling that nothing's working, I don't like any of it, I want it all, I want to run away and just leave it all behind. And that's not true, because usually there's an enormous amount that can be salvaged and worked with, and by throwing it all out, you're left later on regretting. And this is, I think, the big challenge that he's facing with this particular publication. So it's going to happen anyway throughout the year, but with this publication of this book, he's going to be seriously regretting that. We also have Saturn by transit in an opposition to the moon by transit, which will be exact later on that day. By the way, that moon is void of course. Again, there's another thing not to do. If you want to launch anything that has significance or purpose or meaning, that you want to be constructive, never do it when the moon is void of course. Now, later that day, around 3 p.m., the moon will cross over into Virgo. So that's the last aspect the moon makes before going void of course, which is the opposition with Saturn. That's not a great aspect when you want to imprint that into something. So moon is, in general, that's considered to be the public. Opposed by Saturn, that's a feeling of isolation. And guess what it's squaring? So now we've got a T-square between his natal moon, the moon that is by transit, in his 8th house of his deeper relationship to himself, intimate connection, understanding himself. But it's the moon squaring his natal moon. That's very emotional. That's hard when something's going wrong. Moon square moon is hard in the best of times and it's fleeting, thankfully, but it's hard in terms of something significant that you're about to do. One could be churlish and say that actually he does have an astrologer, and the astrologer chose the most damaging time to do something like this. But unfortunately, that damage is going to fall back on Harry. It'll certainly damage the relationships with the people around him. There's no doubt about that. And with the institution of the monarchy. But yeah, the moon square moon, that's family issues as well. Moon square moon, that's that's tough. And so we've got that moon being squared by Saturn, which is a longer term thing because Saturn has been pestering his moon for a long time. That's been basically since the 5th of March, 2022 until the 9th. So literally virtually the moment the book drops, overnight from the 9th to the 10th of January, Saturn is squaring his natal moon. And then it moves out of orb. It doesn't come back into orb. So at least that part is done. But that's emotional isolation. That's feeling it's feeling cut off. It's feeling lonely, even if you're surrounded by people, which he's clearly not. It's really, this is a tough one. It's even hard to do this transit for him because it's going to be, I feel it's going to be quite a significant and harmful self-goal, own goal. But that Jupiter squaring Jupiter is bringing so much hubris into the chart that he's not aware. He's not seeing it at all. And that Saturn and Neptune is not helping because he's not clear either. It's not helping with goals. Pluto semi-sextiling Neptune, not helping with goals and direction. So speaking of that emotional challenge that he's experiencing since the spring of 2020, so April 2020, Neptune has been sextiling his natal moon. So that Neptune from the 3rd house in Pisces is sextiling his 5th house Taurus moon. And, again, that's really very, very sensitive. It can be very creative, super for people who do creative things, but it can be delusional, not seeing clearly. It makes a person tend to be more easily misled. I think that's an important topic right now. It seems to be a lot of what people are discussing in terms of his marriage. Lacking emotional boundaries. Now, this is really important for him because I do think he already has a bit of a problem with that. He's very extra emotional with that Rahu moon and Chiron, and then this Neptune in the 12th, so many other things that I indicated earlier. Lacking emotional boundaries is very, very important. It can be pure delusion, or it can be the sense that something is better than it actually is, particularly with reference to the moon, emotional issues, or what we feel is going to make us happy. You could say with the moon, it's like, what do I think is going to make me happy? And I think he might have set out with the notion that he thought this would make him happy, and I don't think that's going to be the result. So by transit as well, we've got Chiron, which is in a square to his natal ascendant descendant axis. So it's another T-square. There's a couple of T-squares here that are really challenging. You know, T-squares are good for initiative, taking, being dynamic, being forceful, and so on. It's not great for the launch of a project that is meant to live on in people's minds and hearts. It would be potentially interesting if you're building something, if you're starting a war, but not great when you want to build it into something that is about relationship. And Chiron is squaring the relationship axis. So, I mean, it just gets worse and worse, doesn't it? So here we've got Chiron in Aries. What is Chiron in Aries? It's about self-esteem. It's about having a sense of inadequacy about oneself. And where is it? It's in his house of home and family, roots. Heritage, the link that he has with his lineage. So, and that's very strong in his chart. So 4th house is all about that, especially with regards to the family that we know. But the 12th house is the whole lineage, and that's where there's so much rebelling. There's so much rebelling. He keeps referring to the whole of the monarchy as this big business and this big kind of impersonal, faceless thing. I mean, he's not wrong, but you know, it's just to say that's his relationship to it. And so here we have Chiron squaring the ascendant. That is really going to shake him up in terms of his self-esteem. That was already active from the middle of 2020. And it goes, so late June 2020, and it goes to the end of February 2023. So really highly active right now. Later on, it's going to oppose his Venus. And I think that we're going to start to see some issues with their marriage. I won't go into all that now, but I do think that when Saturn moves into Pisces, they have the marriage has Pisces on the 7th house, their wedding chart. And I think when Saturn goes through that, that could pose some real challenges. But certainly Chiron opposing Venus is, that's going to throw a lot of things into question with regards to relationships and money and all kinds of things. That's for later, though. That's for later in the year. And he's going to have that to contend with all the way through 2024, too. Yeah, when I say he's got a hard road, this is really interesting, you know. So it's like these aspects that he's getting right now are all kind of poking at all of the most significant wounds that he has, and he's doing this very, very publicly. So it could, you know, he could even kind of have a breakdown. I wouldn't be surprised, and I wouldn't want that, obviously, but we're talking about Mars in the 6th house opposing Uranus in the 12th, and soon to oppose his natal Mars, and then later to oppose his Neptune, and all of that in the space of 3 months. So very, 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 very high pressure, emotional stuff. Mars technically is also in a square to his Mercury, although that's again 3 degrees off, but still very, very significant because Mars is lingering on that degree. And that Mercury and Chiron is, as I think I mentioned before, it's that Mercury is ruling that Chiron. That's that wounding about, is anybody listening to me? Do you even care? You know, this communication breakdown. But the truth is that he's the one that's not really listening. And so again, there's a lot of projection. If I come back to this Saturn, it's the Pluto in Scorpio generation and that smaller generation of Saturn in Scorpio. There is a tendency to project. There's a, you know, psychological projection. So everything that you're complaining about tends to be what you're doing. And so that's an imprint of the millennial generation. So much projection, and that's what we see on social media, for example. So much complaining and projection. And again, this is in very relevant to him because it's his ruler, and it's also on his midheaven. So very, very descriptive of the way he experiences his life. So much of what he's complaining about, he's not really analyzing in himself. It's all hidden from him, much of it. So to add to all of this, we've got Neptune in opposition to the Sun, and Neptune opposing the Sun is another way of describing a person who finds it hard to find their career path, to find their way forward. And again, that is also about the father. So the Sun is always going to be with reference to the father or to the career, for example, or to one's sense of dharma, the purpose. So all of that is confused by Neptune. It's clouded over, and it has been for a long time. It's been, since June 2020, and it goes all the way till the end of 2023. So this is continuing. It's like he's not seeing his father clearly. He's certainly not communicating clearly with his family. And that's been going for a long time. He's not seeing things clearly. He's not communicating clearly. That's since the spring of 2011. So it's not new. But the frustration is building now to the point that there's an opposition with the Sun. And although it's not this year, it's next year. He will have Neptune squaring Neptune, perhaps later in 2023. I can't remember how far Neptune gets, but it gets maybe to within a couple of degrees of square of his natal Neptune. So that again is a real moment of questioning of life purpose, meaning, etc., etc., but not necessarily seeing things clearly, especially because his natal Neptune is not really seeing things clearly, or it's very, very much connected to potential escapism or delusion and illusory thinking. Oy, oy, oy. So if I come back to this Mars, then again on Chiron, keeping in mind that Mars is not just conjunct the Chiron, but it's also opposite the Uranus, so lots of surprising potential there, to say the least. And it's going to be in the week, well, let's say the 3 weeks even following, because Mars is going to very slowly move off that degree through January. So the consequences of Mars opposing Uranus are not going to be seen until later in January. But nonetheless, that conjunction with Chiron is very much about issues around acceptance. Issues around acceptance versus rejection. And that's all going to come to the surface. Am I loved? Am I, again, like I said, am I listened to? Is anybody paying attention? This is about deep, deep-rooted pain. And this is also a chance to heal. So Chiron always offers the opportunity to learn and to understand and heal. And Mars is about taking action. So it's like a personal transformation, but through pain, And again, Chiron, I want to emphasize, and I think I didn't mention this yet, that Chiron is our own self-sabotage. It's the thing we're doing to ourselves often. The thing that we believe about ourselves that is not true, or the thing that we feel is our role or our lot in life, but it's not true. It's just that we persist in believing it, or we keep acting it out. And so Mars is going to be triggering that. It's going to be triggering this whole childhood wounding scenario. I think there's something there that is going to come to the surface. Now, again, when we look at the degrees, if we look at the degree points for more information, we can see potentially something very significant happening around his sense of intelligence, or his ability to communicate, or issues again around siblings, because Gemini is again the siblings. That is around the age of 8 to 9, something there. So that might all come to the surface. If you know more about that, then drop it in the comments. I have no idea what was going on in his life when he was that age. Yeah, Uranus is going to be on the IC, because Uranus is retrograde currently. It's still actually within orb, so it's conjunct the IC. That started back in May of 2022, and it continues until the 11th of May 2023. So that's a full year of Uranus on the IC, which is very much about disruption around family and disruption around home life, disruption around the emotional connection to your life. And then, of course, by extension, by opposition, that's the midheaven. Uranus has been challenging that midheaven point for a very long time. Keep in mind that in the summer, around July 31st and 1st of August of 2022, Uranus and Mars and the North Node all met within a degree. They were on the 18th degree of this. So that would have been a very intense period for him. So that would have still been in orb to affect his moon as well. What a year, my goodness. Yeah, what else have we got? It's not done yet. So he's also got, by transit, he's got Saturn in conjunct his natal sun. That's heavy as well. That's very, it's irritable, and that would have been for quite some time. That's since the end of March 2022, and it goes until the middle of January. So basically a week after this book launch, that's out of orb, and so no longer pestering him. But it's something to keep in mind, because this is the chart of the book launch. It's not just his transits, but this is the impression. This is the energy that book will hold, and it's going to be super, super uncomfortable. I mean, we knew that because of the contents that have been shared, at least in the news, for those who've been paying attention. And honest to God, I'm trying not to pay attention, but it just it's like all the headlines are talking about this, particularly because I think it's the year that the Queen died, and so people are paying attention to these things. And again, a very brief transit, but nonetheless relevant because of the book launch, is that the moon is in a semi-sextile to the sun, and that can bring also some moodiness, some tension and moodiness when the moon is kind of itching from the 12th house to the sun. Again, it's built into this chart. You have to think of that as an event chart. Again, I might have the timing wrong. I've given it the time of midnight New York or 5 a.m. London, which is the equivalent just for the book launch. If it's earlier in London, then the moon will have an earlier degree. If it's later, it will have a later degree. One aspect that's also quite strong, but again is a minor, so-called minor aspect, it's a less prominent aspect, is that Pluto by transit is quintile, or 1/5 of the chart away from the midheaven. And that's since March 2022, all the way through the end of November 2024. And that creates this kind of compelling urgency for change, especially with regards to all the midheaven points. So your status, your career, your public life, your role in the public, very, very pressurized, which we've seen, but we see that very, very strongly because Pluto is going to go back and forth over that point to within a couple of degrees for a long, long time. So all of 2023 and most of 2024 he's still got remaining. So this is how he shows up in the world. It's really, really transforming. That's also emphasized by the fact that Pluto is going through the first year. Very, very tough moment in his life. And then, of course, the midheaven is also authority figures. So the midheaven is where we see our boss. It's where we see the people above us and some kind of, the authority figures of all descriptions show up as sort of embodied in the midheaven. Like if you think about your job as embodied in the midheaven, it's got authority over you. You have to show up for your job. If you don't show up for your job, there's no income. Just to give you that notion of authority, it's not necessarily a boss, but it's something that has authority over you. And all of that energy is just really compelling him to change in a very, very intense way with Pluto. So the last thing I want to touch on is that the Chiron which is such a very important player in his chart. Chiron by transit is also in conjunct Saturn, his natal Saturn. So that's a 12-degree Saturn, a 12-degree Chiron, and that is a long thing as well. It's been since May 2021 all the way through the end of February, so he's coming to the end of that. It won't bother him again after that, although we'll have it in conjunct with Chiron on the MC. But so he's coming out of that, but that is intense psychological stress, and all the more so because Chiron is in the 4th. Painful realizations about your role in the world, your place in this world, and really needing transformation and healing. It's time to give up old patterns with this. With Chiron, Saturn things, it's about understanding and relieving and growing out of old patterns. what I was saying earlier about that North Node Chiron thing is this kind of feedback loop, which is like the intense desire to heal and change, almost obsessive, and even to be an agent of healing and change, which we see, with that Aldebaran on there. And then we see that also coming through what he claims he'd like to do with his life. But it keeps looping back to this rebellious, unstable nature that just somehow can't let it all go. And of course, Chiron in conjunct Saturn represents relationships with Father as well. So Father can be seen through the Sun as well as Saturn, because we think of the Father as the authority, first authority figure in a person's life. But there will be many, many, many challenges there. And that is, of course, in this is this energy of a T-square. Keep in mind. So, yeah, to wrap it up, I think this book is going to have a massive impact on him personally, psychologically and emotionally. I think he's going to be impacted in a way that I don't even think he is aware of at this point. I do wish him all the best, because I do think that this is a person who has lots of really good intentions. He has some really big aims. He's got a lot to offer the world. He's got an awful lot to offer the world. But he really needs to do this healing. He needs to overcome all of this very deep repressed anger and frustration and resentment for so many things. Keeping in mind, this is his natal chart, so this is already there in the chart, even before he lost his mother. So much has provoked that need to heal this very, very big wound that he has come into this life with, and that is part of his road to healing. He could become a really inspiring source of healing on his own and overcome all of that. And finally, find a certain amount of self-respect as well as communal respect from the community, which he so craves. Do let me know your comments in the comments section if you have any. If you find this kind of thing interesting, please let me know as well, because I really love to show how astrology is showing up in people's lives when a person is so prominent that most people have a kind of a sense of what's going on. It's really easy to use astrology as a teaching tool. And to really integrate what that means, so you can apply it to your chart, you can apply it to clients' charts if you're working with people, or if you're just curious. So thanks for listening, and I will be back again with another video soon.